Well, good evening, and a very warm welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government for this very exciting event, the inaugural lecture of a brand new statutory chair. And a very special welcome tonight to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Beadle, to Dame Louise Richardson. We're thrilled to have you here with us this evening. To Timothy Power, the head of the Social Sciences Division, who's helped make all this happen. To Dame Hilary Boulding, who's president of Trinity. A special, as I said, welcome to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Jane Shaw, who's guiding us through tonight. And to so many supporters and students of the school. I'd like to start just by saying a word about this statutory chair. When I first came to Oxford as a graduate student, somebody rather kindly explained to me that Oxford doesn't do positive feedback. That if you go to a tutorial, or indeed if you're an employee of the university, you'll get strips torn off you if things go badly, and you just simply have to assume that if nobody's torn strips off you, then you're doing okay. And that's the positive feedback side of the university. And being Vice-Chancellor of Oxford not only puts you at the pinnacle of that, but it's also one of the most difficult jobs in the world. You're trying to constantly navigate between the outside world, the inner world of the scholars, the students and very often their families, the community and the communities across the world. It's not an easy gig, and it's not one that you often get thanked for. And it's for that reason that when a supporter of the university came to me and said, we should be marking Louise Richardson's tenure as Vice-Chancellor in some lasting way, I thought, what a wonderful idea. And that led us to a group of absolutely wonderful supporters, some here, some far away this evening, but here in spirit, who stepped up to make it possible to mark the leadership of Dame Louise Richardson of the university during her time as Vice-Chancellor, with a chair, a statutory chair in global security. Fitting because Louise, before her tenure as Vice-Chancellor, was a brilliant scholar of terrorism and international cooperation and the special relationship between Britain and the United States. So the first thing I want to say, heartfelt, to those who give to this university, is thank you for giving us first the ideas and the feedback, then the possibility of giving positive feedback, reminding us that we're doing pretty well sometimes. And in this case, to a Vice-Chancellor, the feedback that she did a wonderful job. And second, your financial support, which makes possible all that this university does and has for 900 years made possible all that this university does. And to make possible a statutory chair at Oxford is to make possible a program which will last for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's what we're here tonight doing. We're here to listen to the first holder of this statutory chair in global security. And that person, an extraordinary special academic scholar, public explainer, teacher, and colleague, is Janina Dill. Janina did her undergraduate work at Dresden before going to Cambridge to do a master's, but then switching to Oxford to do a doctorate. Happy tone of voice there, and being awarded the highly competitive Junior Research Fellowships of Oxford, not once, but twice, before taking a full-time academic position in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Janina became co-director of the Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, an institute which I'm delighted to say now has feet firmly in this place. And in 2021, won the Philip Leverhulme Prize in 2022 was awarded the title Professor. And perhaps more importantly than all of that, Janina, who I first heard of when she was a junior research fellow and people were talking about this brilliant young woman who was carving already furrows in Oxford. And I see, and I'm delighted to see Professor Henry Hsu, her doctoral supervisor, here in the audience this evening. As a colleague, she's quickly been seen by all of us in the school as one of those clear blue flames, you know, the flame that comes from pure gas, who in her teaching, in her research, but also in her citizenship as a colleague, brings a standard of outstanding to everything she does. And for that, we're all so grateful to the people that made the chair possible, and to Janina for applying, and for all those of you who have supported her along the way, including her family, to make her the person, the colleague, the scholar, and the teacher that she is today. I'm going to invite Janina to come to the stage. I just want to say that in the Blavatnik School of Government, we never, ever let people speak without taking questions. But tonight is an exception because we do defer to the university's long-standing traditions. And the university has a rule with its inaugural lectures that the lecturer gets to say their piece, and then you all get to have a drink and discuss what she said over drinks. So Janina will give her lecture. I will then invite you to join us for drinks, and you'll have an opportunity over drinks to ask her questions. But if you could join me in welcoming to the stage the inaugural Dame Louise Richardson Chair in Global Security, Janina Dill.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to speak to you today about the mass death and starvation of civilian populations across armed conflict in the world today. In 2023, 33,000 civilian deaths were recorded in armed conflicts, a 72% increase from the year before. UN OCHA reported that 11,000 children were killed and another 33,000 wounded or maimed, the highest number since mandated monitoring. In fact, 2023 was the deadliest year for civilians in armed conflict since 1994, the year of the Rwandan genocide. And this year is likely to surpass the previous one. In Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, Sudan, Somalia, Burkina Faso were particularly deadly places for civilians. If alive, civilians in these places face conditions inimical to life, including conflict-related food insecurity and starvation. In fact, right now, 28 million people in the world are at emergency levels of food insecurity, and 300,000 are facing starvation, all in the context of armed conflict, with Gaza and Sudan the worst affected places, according to the Integrated Food Security Phase classification. People in Gaza are starved to death while trucks with food wait mere miles from where they perish, and the world has been watching. For people not living in armed conflict, so most of us, though not all of us tonight, it is almost impossible to fathom the soul-crushing inhumanity of life in a war zone. The non-contingent reality of war is incompatible with a minimally flourishing, dignified human life. And yet, to understand this staggering catastrophe as a crisis of global security and to articulate political solutions, we must adjust the concept of security that prevails in scholarship and government. This is my first goal tonight and my long-term goal as holder of this chair, to articulate and defend global security as a moral goal. Although there's no straightforward way to stem the tide of armed conflict and the human misery in its wake, I would also like to submit to you that law is our only hope for global security, conceived as I propose it should be. It is the only means through which to pursue global security. Yet international law, particularly the rules tasked with preventing and constraining armed conflict, face their own crisis. a crisis that makes international law less able to discharge its urgent task, less functional as a means to pursue global security. The task of strengthening international law, then, is an urgent security concern, one I will suggest we all have a role to play in addressing. Let's begin. What is global security? Allow me to take a short stroll into political theory along a path that is probably familiar to many, though maybe not all listeners. Inside the state, security is traditionally defined as the government's ability to monopolize violence, so lay down rules for the community's or society's coexistence and use violence exclusively to enforce these rules. Indeed, this task of securing the community through the monopolization of violence is often cast as the primary task of government, the reason even for the state. When it comes to global or international security, the state is then traditionally viewed as a means of representing the people vis-à-vis other states. And security between states is achieved by them not interfering with each other on each other's territory, including by forcible means. So the goal of global security in this traditional view in academic literature as well as in politics is the prevention of the use of force between states, or the absence of interstate war. The beneficiary of international security is the state, and the means by which we establish security are predominantly diplomatic, though of course they're also military, because traditionally we assume that the best way for states to keep each other off each other's territory is deterrence by military means. In this traditional understanding of global security, which is embodied in the United Nations Charter and foundational to the post-war international order, the individual is not a direct beneficiary of global security, which matters in cases when the absence of war between states is a goal in tension with the safety of individuals. Almost as soon as Russia marched on Kyiv in February 2022, scholars of security, political pundits, and even world leaders demanded that Ukraine cede significant parts of its then occupied territory to Russia. Restoring global security meant to them achieving a return to the non-use of force across state borders, even if it meant redrawing those state borders. In this traditional concept of security, there's little space for the rape, torture, disappearance, and death that civilians systematically face under Russian occupation to register as concerns of global security. Of course, many of you will already know that this concept of global security has long since come under contestation. Contested is also the idea that abandoning Ukrainian civilians to Russian control is the path to global security. Indeed, over the last 50 years, mainstream understandings of security have gradually become broadened, with additional goals besides the absence of interstate war becoming goals of security. This is reflected in the United Nations reports from around the 1970s onwards, which suggest that security is a condition in which states are not only free from military threat, but capable of pursuing development and prosperity. A little later in the history of the United Nations, the concept of security also becomes deepened, reaching through the sovereign veil of the state to elevate the individual to become a beneficiary of global security in her or his own right, which is predominantly encapsulated in the so-called human security movement from the late 90s. This broadened and deepened concept of security, however, raised a question. Now that the goal is not just for states to be free from military threat, but the goal is for states and individuals to secure and enjoy political freedoms, education, health, the environment, prosperity, and development, what are the means of security? Indeed, this apparently salutary deepening and broadening of security caused a loss of focus and arguably over-expansion of the concept captured with the not uncontroversial term securitization. Securitization is the idea that any object, health, the environment, the climate, biodiversity, foreign trade, any object can be framed as a subject of an existential threat, and the prevention of that threat then becomes a means of security, often by any means, really. The understanding that any substantive goal benefiting anyone can be a goal of global security obviously robs the term of its analytical value, which is a problem for academics uncertain what to study. But much more importantly, it has nefarious consequences for government. Securitization of an object like health or the environment tends to unleash draconian politics in the name of countering the constructed threat, over-budgeting, disregard for opportunity costs, emergency politics, and often rule-breaking. Securitization then is first and foremost and most often a failure of government. A failure to appropriately address a threat within the normal means and bounds and rules of politics, often with disastrous consequences. So global security in some sense is lodged between the rock of an empty signifier for interstate war and the hard place of conceptual overexpansion and political abuse. We need a better way of understanding global security then, one that recognizes that the term shapes what governments prioritize, how they allocate attention and resources. I suggest that since the term is a tool of political prioritization, it must reflect what governments should prioritize in the allocation of attention and resources. The goal of global security should reflect a moral priority, values for which it is worth breaking the rules and incurring steep opportunity costs. The delineation of global security as a concept must not then be left to empirical political scientists. Instead, we must recognize that affixing this label to an issue is a moral choice, and the conceptual definition of security must be inflected with moral meaning. So let me make a proposal that starts with the insight that the beneficiary of global security must be the individual. The individual is the only locus of intrinsic moral value in the universe. States and communities may be valuable, but their value is always derived from the value they have to individuals, and that is contingent. They may or may not have value. But we can always rely on the fact that each and every individual has intrinsic moral value. That far, I agree with the concept of human security. But not every aim that has moral value, even to individuals, should then be pursued as a quest for security. First and foremost, individuals need rights. A right is a rational basis for a justified demand, justified to generate correlative duties on the parts of others. Joel Feinberg famously accounted for the elevated moral importance of rights in terms of their relation to human dignity. I quote, "Rights are not mere gifts or favors, motivated by love or pity. A world with claim rights is one in which all persons, as actual or potential claimants, are dignified objects of respect." So global security must be concerned with rights. Of course, if we recognize the guarantee of all rights as matters of security, we would end up exactly where the concept of security left us: conceptual overexpansion and political abuse. Instead, I believe we must rely on the seminal concept of basic rights, articulated by Henry Shue. Henry, hi. Henry argues that two rights are basic in the sense that their enjoyment is a precondition for the enjoyment of all other rights. This is first, individuals' physical security, and second, their right to subsistence. Physical security and subsistence are obviously far from all that is necessary for a flourishing life, but they are a condition for all that is necessary. Without basic rights, we do not get around to enjoying other rights. Of course, public policy must address other matters. Many more rights even need to be secured by governments, including across borders. Yet for those individuals for whom governments do not secure basic rights, all other endeavors of governments are futile. Critically, that rights are basic doesn't mean they have lexical priority, which would mean that we can only ever allocate resources or attention to anything else once basic rights are perfectly and fully guaranteed. It can't mean that, right? Neither does it mean that a yet better basic rights protection for some people will always trump protecting many non-basic rights for others. Instead, Shue argues that the correlative duties of governments to guarantee the enjoyment of basic rights is a duty to protect them against standard threats. What does this mean? Well, in Ukraine, the predominant duty of governments is then to protect the basic rights to physical safety and subsistence of Ukrainians, including those under Russian occupation. Any countervailing consideration, and there are many countervailing considerations, this isn't sort of a means to just reduce complexity, right? But any countervailing consideration must also be cast in terms of basic rights, both the rights of Ukrainians and those of other people. The right, for instance, to subsistence to people around the world threatened by violations of the grain deal, or the rights both to physical security and subsistence of people everywhere threatened by nuclear escalation. But the goal of great power stability, evacuated as it often is of substantive moral consideration, would not trump our duties of counteracting and the systematic deprivation of Ukrainians' basic rights to physical safety and subsistence under Russian occupation. I will turn in a moment to why this understanding of global security is oriented on the goal of protecting basic rights against standard threats requires prioritizing armed conflict, both its prevention as a threat to basic rights and its regulation as on occasion a means of protecting basic rights to physical safety and subsistence. But for now, let me summarize and submit to you that the more directly implicated a matter is in people's basic rights, the closer it is to the core business of global security as a policy endeavor and field of study. Policies that discharge a government's duty to protect its own citizens' physical integrity and subsistence rights against standard societal threats are politics we should consider those of national security. Policies and measures that protect individuals' physical integrity and subsistence rights against standard global threats, so those emanating and materializing across borders, are policies and measures we should consider global security. Let's delegitimize the empty quest for interstate stability as a stand-in for global security, but equally so, the abusive emergency politics riding in on the understanding of all things good and valuable being concerns of security. Affixing the term global security to a policy measure is an act of political prioritization. Articulating a concept of global security is then a task of moral prioritization. I suspect that this proposal, global security as the protection of basic rights against standard global threats, will be no more popular in philosophy than it is probably in political science or the most relevant subfield of security studies, which tends to eschew explicitly normative argument. The legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron, in his own inaugural lecture here in Oxford about a decade ago, categorically stated, I quote, "Security is not a moral concept. Excluding it from the ends of life that are the proper preoccupation of philosophers and the proper pursuit of governments, chiefly equality, justice, and liberty." Indeed, both sides of this disciplinary divide between explanatory political science and normative political philosophy tend to think of security as the bullying mafioso, to which equality, liberty, and justice must occasionally pay tribute, who quite stands on his own apart. But security is intrinsically morally valuable if conceived in moral terms. Given its power to shape government, this is how it should be conceived. What follows? What follows from this understanding of global security as a moral goal? Specifically, how does this actually implicate international law, you may wonder? Well, first in a sort of trivial sense, because the duty primarily incumbent on governments to protect individuals' basic rights against standard threats actually implies incredibly ambitious political tasks. It was one of the central insights of Henry's book, which was first published in 1980, that both basic rights, physical security and subsistence, imply negative duties not to deprive individuals of these things, but also positive duties of prevention, of protection, and of remedial assistance. Discharging these positive duties obviously requires coordination and collaboration by governments that is impossible without building fair and effective international institutions. It is impossible then without law. Indeed, the question mark at the end of this lecture, is law our last hope, cannot really be seen as anything but rhetorical. A world in which states manage to coordinate and collaborate as required to discharge their moral duties, even just those correlative to basic rights, is simply unimaginable without law. Analytically, this insight is almost trivial, but politically it is surprisingly controversial. So when particularly Western governments that view themselves as standard bearers of international law weaken or obstruct international institutions, then it is appropriate, depending on the institution, to view this at minimum as an indirect threat to global security. But I'd like to return to the facts I put before you at the beginning of this lecture. They should make clear that the most direct, persistent threat to global security, to individuals' enjoyment of basic rights to physical safety and subsistence, are violations of the negative duty not to actively deprive individuals of these rights, chiefly in the context of armed conflicts, which systematically kill and starve the innocent. Armed conflict is not the only threat to global basic rights, but it is the most persistent, pervasive, direct basic rights catastrophe Its avoidance and limitation, therefore, the most urgent task of global security, and the task to which much of my teaching, research, and advisory is really almost entirely dedicated. Of course, discharging the negative duty not to kill or starve the innocent doesn't seem to require coordination through international institutions. You just shouldn't do it. So what is the task precisely of law in this context? Well, law has two different tasks. Most of the time, the best way to avoid depriving individuals of their basic rights is by not waging war. But the case of Ukraine makes clear that protecting basic rights sometimes requires the use of armed force. Law's first task is then to lay down rules that specify when war is an instrument of global basic rights and when it is a threat to them, the so-called law on the resort to force. The second task is for law to limit how wars are conducted. Even in a war that plausibly pursues the aim of protecting basic rights, such as Ukraine's defensive struggle against Russia, even in such a war, some people will be deprived of their basic rights, and it is the task of the laws of war to prescribe how wars are waged so as to minimize these deprivations and channel violence towards justified deprivations. To figure out how important law is in this context, let us take a step back and ask in what context law is generally needed, to where it makes the most difference in terms of helping us discharge our moral duties. These are contexts, I suggest to you, characterized by either one or sometimes two features. First, it is difficult to see what is morally right. Concretely, there are epistemic obstacles to discerning what must be done to protect basic rights. Law in these cases can specify what is right, how moral reasons most often apply to us in specific contexts, and it can reduce epistemic uncertainty so as to produce better consequences overall. Second, even when it is easy to see what is right, it is hard to do. So contexts in which decision makers systematically encounter a misalignment between their incentives and what is right. Those contexts are characterized by so-called volitional defects. Law can help provide incentives to do the right thing, and one way in which law can do this, soften volitional defects, is by reducing uncertainty. Law provides increased specificity compared to moral duties, which allows third parties to easier see when someone doesn't discharge their duties. So it's easier to judge illegality than immorality. The resulting additional visibility of deviation is then a reason not to deviate in the first instance, to be consistent in discharging one's duties. So both features, epistemic uncertainty and volitional defects, systematically characterize the use of force in global affairs. This may strike you as quite abstract, so bear with me, and let's talk about existing international law and when it's actually permissible to resort to war in international relations. Because actually it discharges the task to specify when war is a means rather than a threat to global basic rights really not very well at all, because it is focused on the rights of states and threats by states. It's really stuck in the traditional understanding of security as all about states. And yet still, this incredibly imperfect law is evidently morally better for global rights and for global basic rights, and hence better for global security, if leaders followed it every time rather than follow their own judgment. The cycle of escalatory retaliations by Iran and Israel brings this into sharp relief. Very basically, international law draws a very bright line here. It forbids resort to force in retaliation against a prior wrong, or as punishment for harms already committed. This makes sense most of the time in international affairs because punitive harming most often implies simply more deprivations of rights, less global security. Wisely, then, law specifies moral duties by limiting self-defense to the preemption of an imminent attack or the defense against an ongoing attack, to preventing rather than redressing harms. The British government is forensic in distinguishing legal self-defense from illegal escalatory retaliation every time Iran illegally retaliates against Israel, not so when Israel illegally retaliates against Iran. An inconsistency painfully visible thanks to the law. When it comes to conduct in war, my prior work has explored how systematic epistemic obstacles and volitional defects in war ground the law's moral authority to guide our action, specifically to justify the relatively bright line that law again draws between combatants and civilians. Combatants in the law are always legitimate targets of intentional attack. Civilians are never legitimate targets of intentional attack. At least that's where the law starts. The distinction doesn't perfectly reflect differences in moral innocence or basic rights retention. Not all combatants forfeit their right to physical safety. Not all civilians retain theirs. Yet following this legal rule in war improves soldiers' ability to discharge their moral duties. It has better consequences for basic rights than leaving soldiers to figure out who on the other side is morally liable to killing, who retains their rights. Indeed, the laws of war are better suited to guiding action in this particular epistemic and volitional context of war than even the morally much more nuanced human rights law. I have ambitiously put my own 2 books on this topic next to those that have most directly influenced my thinking on this matter, chiefly Adel Haag's book on law and morality at war and Cécile Fabre's work on cosmopolitan war. Can't see Cécile. So what does law concretely need to do to fulfill its tasks in war? Let us go one step further. In a recent article with Tom Dannenbaum, I articulate what it takes for law to reduce epistemic uncertainty and soften or counteract volitional defects in war. Tom and I argue that law needs to fulfill 3 concrete functions. Let's take the example of Israel's conduct in Gaza to see how this could play out. The first function is ex ante action guidance. So law can be more specific than just restating moral duties, and it fulfills this function if it concretely prescribes how Israel must use force, reducing epistemic uncertainty. For instance, never directly target civilians, never intentionally starve civilians. The second function is guiding concurrent, so while it's going on, third-party evaluation and response. Given its specificity and the resulting visibility of violations of law, law is meant to allow third parties like the British, German, or American governments to look at conduct like Israel's in Gaza and be able to judge whether it actually meets legal standards. This should be easier than to judge this conduct morally. The improved ability of third parties to evaluate warring parties' conduct in turn should provide an incentive for these warring parties to do the right thing. Since third parties, like the UK, Germany, and the United States, are legally obligated to withdraw their support from warring parties that break the law. Law thereby softens volitional defects. And the third function is ex post accountability, so after the fact. Law is a mechanism to hold account those who do not discharge their duties. Many legal demands for how wars must be waged, like prohibitions on targeting or starving civilians, are criminalized. The recent arrest warrants issued by the ICC against Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Gallant, and Hamas leader Daif are powerful examples of how law is meant to operate. In addition, the state behind the individual can incur responsibility and may owe compensation if it is later found to have violated the law. This last function should further counteract volitional defects, deterring violation of the law in the first place. Many listeners may say, well, I don't have trouble telling right from wrong in war. I see Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine as wrong. I see Russia's conduct in the occupied territories as violations of the moral duty not to starve or kill the innocent. I don't need law to perform my third-party evaluation of this conduct. And I would be glad to hear that. But the people who most need to discern this moral truth are also most likely to face significant epistemic obstacles, stemming from propaganda, misinformation, from having grown up with narratives that misconstrue Ukraine's national identity, devalue Ukrainian life, that saturate everything from political speeches in Russia to Russian lullabies. This is no justification, but it explains the importance of the law's functions. Moreover, if we shift our gaze back to the Middle East, generally it is staggering for how many people around the world it seems impossible to recognize Hamas actions on the 7th of October as staggering violations of the categorical duty not to kill the innocent. Even more people in powerful positions seem to find it nigh on impossible to recognize Israel's actions in Gaza in the years since as violations of the moral duties not to kill or starve the innocent. Basic rights violation on a truly stunning scale. Because once we identify individuals or groups as vulnerable moral patients, we are systematically inhibited from understanding that they may be agents of moral wrongdoing yet. Once we dehumanize or see groups as individuals as lesser, we have trouble seeing their innocence and the basic rights that inhere in them too. So law is there to encage us in a commitment that all human beings have basic rights, a commitment to discharge our moral duties equally without fear or favor, and to give sufficient specificity to these duties that we are a little bit more likely than we would otherwise be to discharge them, even in the moment when we really have an overwhelming incentive not to do so, or at those times when it is genuinely difficult to discern what they demand. Law is meant to be a cage of specificity and consistency. As such, it is sometimes much less than perfect, but it is what we have. Of course, almost as old as the attempt to subject war to law and encage us in law is the philosophical attempt to discredit this project as distracting from the quest of forever overcoming violence and war. Samuel Moyn, legal philosopher at Yale, has most recently and influentially leveled this charge against the contemporary laws of war. Moyn has argued specifically that the American way of war has become, I quote, more expansive in scope and perpetual in time by virtue of its subjection to law. Even as far as the United States is concerned, and this is a view particular to the United States, this argument mistakes an overdetermined condition of possibility for a cause. By that I mean that some other mechanism would very likely perform the same legitimizing or enabling function if it wasn't for the law, but the causal force behind endless US wars is certainly not law. Here, incidentally, is Moyn's response on Twitter to the announcement of this lecture, the title asking whether law was our last hope, generating an answer of no from him. So yes, maybe the legalization of war makes it easier for some people to participate in it. But the causes of our failure to eradicate violence in global affairs are political and psychological, not legal. The benefit of delegitimating law for delegitimating war is entirely speculative. But the cost of delegitimating law for basic rights and for global security are concrete and devastating. What I have laid out so far to you is a theory of the added value of law, the difference it can in principle make in a context like armed conflict, characterized by people having difficulty discerning their moral duties, and even greater difficulty discharging them when they can see them. In such a context, law has a vital role to play in reducing our human imperfection, both our tragic limitation in discernment and our psychological weaknesses. But what if I told you that this critical, all-important law faced a crisis of its own, that its vital contribution to global security was at risk? Well, in the first instance, you might not find this entirely plausible if you've been listening to the news, because this law is clearly more relevant than ever. Right now, international law on war is omnipresent in public discourse, particularly around Israel's war in Gaza and Russia's war in Ukraine, but not only these wars. Press commentaries strikingly often framed in legal terms. Israel, Russia, Ukraine, even Hezbollah, and to some extent Hamas, often, though with different levels of plausibility, affirm that their wars are legal and conducted legally. Really only Ukraine that should affirm that. For the first time, certainly in my professional life, court cases, for instance, before the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice get viral attention on social media. And indeed, studies in political science show that international law has become the indispensable tool for asserting legitimacy about war. This is true not just for elites, but with caveats also for general publics. My own work has shown that different publics are responsive to legal claims and that they support the use of force less if it violates legal demands. Legality has become the yardstick for political appropriateness in war. Moreover, in one sense, this law of war is always in a crisis. International lawyers tend to think that the laws of war are perpetually in what is called a crisis of compliance. And this isn't surprising, given what I told you about volitional defects. States and armed groups in war deem themselves in an emergency and naturally regard their survival as more important than rule following. What makes them unlikely to discharge their moral duties also puts pressure on rule following, on following the law. So the laws of war are always in some sort of crisis of compliance. But they are now in a crisis that is both broader and deeper. It is broader because it implicates not just parties to the war and their compliance, like Russia, Hezbollah, but also third parties like Germany, like the United States and the United Kingdom. And the crisis is deeper because through that implication, it is not just compliance that is at stake, but the very authority of law to limit and structure war. So where does this crisis come from and what must be done to overcome it? In fact, the crisis is born, somewhat paradoxically, from the law's political relevance and fueled, tragically, by lack of political courage, political choice. So law is in a crisis that is first and foremost political. Let me explain. How does law's political relevance bear the crisis? How do political choices fuel it? Well, the more public attention international law gets, the more public attention there's also on its limits, on the fact that international law doesn't operate in accordance to the logic and quite in the way that most of us associate with law. This creates a risk of backlash. For instance, the fact that the ICC never has pushed out an arrest warrant against Bashar al-Assad. It's very hard to imagine. There are very good legal reasons, but it's very hard to understand for most people watching. But this backlash against international law that comes from public attention to it is by no means inevitable. It is due to a choice and depends on how states engage with legal processes that garner this attention. For instance, the case South Africa versus Israel before the International Court of Justice, or indeed the activities of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. These processes have the potential to solidify international role as the yardstick for normative evaluation of war, including now vis-à-vis powerful Western states and their allies, or they can do the opposite, reveal international law's infirmity, its incapacity to meaningfully restrain everybody equally. In Ukraine, third states like the United States and the United Kingdom have by and large managed to meet their own obligations, call out violations of international law in real time, welcome proceedings before international courts. In Gaza, meanwhile, these same states seem able only to call out the violations of the side they do not consider an ally, that doesn't resemble themselves, undercutting and delegitimizing judicial processes that scrutinize both sides, as judicial processes should. This juxtaposition of the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, then, is a perfect storm, hastening the denouement of Western commitments to international law as contingent. Of course, the public attention on international law, particularly in the context of Gaza, is no accident. It is a sign of a public demand for legal constraints on the use of force. And yes, it is a sign for the urgency of law's moral task. But Gaza also raises a question about the fitness of law. Catastrophic civilian harm here coincides with Israeli officials consistently, often proactively arguing that their military operations adhere to international law, a line of argument repeated then by some Western governments and even experts. Military operations are cast as legal that on some measures, like children killed per day of fighting, cause unmatched civilian harm. This obviously has the potential to plunge the law into yet a different crisis and raises the question whether law is actually failing to fulfill its functions in this context. The function it is meant to fulfill, particularly while wars are ongoing, guiding third warring parties' actions or constraining these actions, and help third parties evaluate and respond to these actions in real time. Does law fulfill these real-time functions in Gaza? Or let me put the question differently. Many governments do not seem to want to look too closely at Israel's conduct, but what if they did? Does the coincidence of a claim of legal compliance and catastrophic civilian harm not also raise the question whether international law provides the doctrinal resources and institutional frames that actually help third parties evaluate conduct in real time? Tom Dannenbaum and I have investigated what doctrinal questions actually underpin the very polarized legal evaluations of Israel's conduct in Gaza. Questions that would need to be answered, or are answered, for law to fulfill its function, particularly of guiding third-party evaluation of ongoing hostilities in real time. We argue specifically that the war in Gaza has spotlighted two questions as at the heart of law's capacity to discharge this function. First, how to conceptualize intent in war, and second, how to evaluate international courts' early-stage engagement with an ongoing conflict. Early-stage engagement, for instance, the ICC's arrest warrants or the International Court of Justice's provisional measures orders. So court pronouncements that are not definitive, but provisional and therefore happen while a war is still ongoing. So let me briefly speak to the role of intent. Some very strikingly divergent evaluation of Israel's conduct in Gaza hinge on what intent is attributed to Israeli officials. Are mass civilian casualties unavoidable and potentially legal in an operational context that is, after all, characterized by the co-location of civilian and military objects? Or are thousands of deaths evidence of intentional attacks against civilians in violation of distinction, which can also be a war crime? When it comes to hunger in Gaza, and you see there the map of hunger in Gaza, which is entirely red, some portray the crisis as a tragic consequence of civilians being caught in the middle of a fight, while others identify intentional starvation of civilians as a method of war, which is prohibited and a war crime. And of course, whether we need to sound the alarm about genocide or whether the allegation is morally repugnant depends on whether the observer entertains the possibility that Israeli officials have the special intent to destroy in whole or in part Palestinians as a group, so genocidal intent. Some of these evaluations are due to divergent understandings of the facts, but some are due to doctrinal confusion about prohibited intent in the conduct of hostilities, starvation, and genocide. Tom and I developed concrete answers or responses to each of these questions, but a common theme across these responses is that many evaluations of Israel's conduct right now, specifically evaluations where the demand is that we defer judgment until courts had time to assess Israel's conduct, commit a so-called forensic fallacy. That means they use an intent standard associated with law's accountability function, here criminal intent, as the yardstick for judging compliance in real time. But in law, the substantive and inferential intent standards differ depending on whether we seek to establish a violation of the laws of war or a crime. Moreover, it makes just sense to think that third-party efforts to respond to an ongoing war cannot plausibly be conditioned on that third party operating like a criminal court. Rather, intent must be conceptualized and inferred differently depending on the legal function at stake. So does the conduct of Israel of hostilities provide evidence of violations of distinction? We argue that on a proper reading of the law, the answer is yes. The US government last year produced a report to Congress on National Security Memorandum 20, which was meant to establish whether the US could safely export weapons to Israel. The report itself contains evidence of a pattern of attacks without a plausible military target, combined with the observation that precautions to protect civilians were not taken. At the same time, the report argues that it couldn't find evidence that civilians were intentionally targeted, implying that intent meant bringing about civilian casualties with purpose, which is indeed almost impossible to just infer from the context. This, we argue, is a misunderstanding of the intent requirement in distinction. A proper reading of customary law and of jurisprudence suggests that a violation of distinction means directing an attack against an object or person the attacker knows or has reason to believe is protected object or person. The evidence the report itself contains suggests that attacks are recklessly or knowingly directed against civilians. Whether this is criminal is contestable, but that it violates the laws of war is beyond doubt. Similarly, it has been argued that Israel's purpose in restricting humanitarian access to Gaza, the siege and starvation of the population there, is to date unclear. And since we cannot establish the purpose, it cannot be asserted that Israel is violating the law's starvation ban. We argue that depriving a predominantly civilian population of objects indispensable to its survival violates the law, even if starvation may simply be expected, rather being the purpose of that deprivation. On this understanding, Israel's siege of northern Gaza specifically, the restriction on humanitarian access, attacks against deconflicted humanitarian convoys, and destruction of agricultural sites all visibly violate the law's starvation ban. This is true even though it is uncertain what the criminal intent standard attaching to the war crime of starvation is, specifically whether it requires purpose. Last Thursday, of course, the ICC issued arrest warrants against the principal architects of Israel's siege on Gaza, confirming that there are reasonable grounds to believe that it involves not only the war crime of starvation, but that impeding the delivery of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians in Gaza for almost a year, over a year, may also amount to crimes against humanity. While violation of distinction and prohibition on starvation does not require purpose in law, genocide obviously does, both as a criminal act of an individual, but also as an act of a state. The special intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group means purpose, the goal to do that. But here a different question arises. Does this mean that conduct that poses a substantial risk of group destruction does not trigger duties under the Genocide Convention until that point in time where group destruction is evidently its purpose. Genocidal intent, so the purpose to destroy a group, is almost never obvious in real time. When it comes to state intent, discerning it is further complicated because a state intent is a legal construct. It depends on the goals of individuals. So given this very high degree of epistemic obscurity of genocidal intent, if conduct poses a real and imminent risk of group destruction, then we argue it poses a risk of genocide. This doesn't mean that a state could ever be responsible for violations under the Genocide Convention until genocidal intent, or unless it could be actually shown to the requisite inferential and substantial standards. But it does mean that during and before an ongoing risk of group destruction, bracketing intent, as the ICJ arguably did in its provisional measures orders, is appropriate for genocide prevention and follows from a functionally differentiated interpretation of international law. Sorry. It is tragic and indeed somewhat surprising dereliction of duty then, that merely a week ago the British government responded to the question whether it had evaluated Israel's conduct in light of the allegation of genocide. First by the PM evoking October the 7th as if one such horror could ever justify another, and then in writing by stating that only a competent court could determine genocide. The International Court of Justice, which is already on the case in a competent course, takes more than a decade to do that. That'll be too late for Palestinians, too late for the children of Gaza. The idea surely of a prevention duty logically implies that third parties must discharge it before the event has fully materialized. Which brings us to the critical role of courts and their early stage engagement with armed conflict for appropriate third-party evaluation and response. Courts obviously are meant to, and they primarily contribute to the law's accountability function. Yet the difficulty of evaluating armed conflict, particularly including intent of warring parties in real time, increases the potential relevance of the ICJ's, International Court of Justice's provisional measures, and also of provisional products like arrest warrants, which may be overturned, right? They're not definitive judgments. Indeed, this is precisely how law can and must help us deal with epistemic uncertainty and help us fight the temptation of inconsistency through judicial processes that guide evaluation in real time. There are open doctrinal questions, particularly regarding the ability of provisional measures orders to create or modify third-party obligations, because they're only meant to bind the parties to the case. But there is no doubt, Professor Dannenbaum and I argue, that these provisional court pronouncements modify the epistemic environment in which third parties discharge their own legal duties. For instance, the duty to ensure respect for the laws of war under Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the duty not to transfer arms when there is an overriding risk that they will be used for violations of the laws of war under the Arms Trade Treaty, or the duty to prevent genocide. Yet many governments, including our own here, wish not to accept the law's guidance. So let's make no mistake. No doctrinal clarification of the law's intent standard and no shoring up of the third-party implications of courts' provisional products can ultimately solve a crisis of law that is political. In the first instance, international law is in a crisis born from the paradoxical effect of political relevance, which is itself an expression of the moral importance of the public demand for the constraining functions in the face of unfathomable human suffering and armed conflict. It is a crisis fueled then by inappropriate third-party response to non-compliance due to a lack of political courage to implement international law without fear or favor. Both sources and remedy of the crisis are political choices, choices that lie with governments, including the government of this country. Which brings me to the final point of today's lecture and the missing ingredient, as it were. I suggested in part one of this lecture that the goal of global security is securing basic rights against standard global threats. If defined in this way, security is a morally valuable goal with a place among the ends of human life, the proper pursuits of government, and even the proper preoccupation of philosophers, like equality, justice, and liberty. I argued that law provides the critical structures and processes through which we must pursue this end, the proper and indispensable means of pursuing global security. But even if we pursued security defined as the protection of global basic rights through the best possible legal institutions, law perfectly suitable to discharging its action guiding and evaluative functions in real time, this would be no guarantee that we could stem the tide of armed conflict and the human misery in its wake, because it matters who inhabits these processes. Law cannot make up for the utter lack of political courage and moral consistency that befalls leaders that refuse to apply it. Which is why I'm very glad that this chair was endowed here at the Blavatnik School of Government, with its mission to educate succeeding generations of public servants and public leaders. I'd also like to thank the students for coming out tonight. Because when research and public engagement leave me hopeless about the ability of law to appropriately engage leaders in consistency that do their utmost not to see what is before them, I retain the joy of teaching students who will inhabit these processes in the future, and who will hopefully bring the virtue, character, and courage to redeem the hope that law provides yet for global security. Thank you.
Well, you've already shown your wonderful appreciation of Janina Dill's lecture, a rallying cry to remind us that international law is not just there to guide governments and soldiers. It's not just there to hold governments to account or militaries to account, but it's also there to protect us when we're civilians in conflict by rallying the rest of the world to uphold that law. And it's a very timely reminder for everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Janina Dill, and thank you all for making tonight both possible and such a wonderful event. Please do join us now in the seminar rooms, which are directly behind us, for drinks and for discussion of this wonderfully powerful lecture. Thank you all.